You know, it's kind of a sobering thought when you really stop and think about it.
What's that?
For every 10 potential new medicines that actually make it to clinical trials,
Yeah.
only about one actually gets through all those hoops and hurdles and makes it to the people who desperately need it.
Yeah,
That's a pretty huge failure rate, right?
it is a huge failure rate.
When you think about it.
Definitely.
So right off the bat, you realize, okay, developing new therapies,
Mm-hmm.
this is not a simple thing.
Not at all.
And it gets even more complex when you start to think about, not just testing a drug in one place,
Right.
but what about coordinating those studies across multiple countries?
Mm-hmm.
Different regulations, different cultures, different everything.
Yeah, global drug development.
Yeah.
That's the big leagues.
It is.
Definitely.
So this deep dive, we're going to kind of tackle this fascinating
Okay.
and often surprisingly challenging world of global clinical trials.
I like it.
This whole complex dance of how do you run research in all these different regions.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you're tuning in because you want to really get a good handle on this topic
Quickly
and thoroughly.
That's what we're here for.
And we've got some great source material to work with today.
All right.
We've got a transcript
Mm-hmm.
that covers various aspects of drug development,
Okay.
everything from the nitty-gritty lab work to, the regulatory hurdles.
Right.
But our real focus today
Yeah.
is those specific hurdles that pop up when you're doing trials on a multinational scale.
I'm intrigued.
So think global clinical trials. What are the challenges?
Gotcha.
Our mission, if you will,
Okay.
is to really equip you with a clear understanding of
Mm-hmm.
all those regulatory, logistical, cultural obstacles
Right.
that researchers bump into when they're trying to bring these promising new treatments to people worldwide.
That makes sense.
Get ready, because there are definitely some light bulb moments coming your way as we go through this.
I-
I think one of the things that really struck me right off the bat, looking at this material,
Mm-hmm.
is just how incredibly collaborative drug development on a global scale really is.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not like one lone genius
Right.
tinkering away in a lab and then ta-da.
No magic bullet.
Yeah, there's no magic bullet.
It's a team effort.
It's a huge network. You've got scientists from all different fields.
Of course.
You've got those super rigorous regulatory bodies in all the different countries.
Yes, and I caught up.
The pharmaceutical companies themselves driving the research.
Uh-huh.
And then, of course, and maybe most importantly,
Yeah.
the patients who are actually volunteering,
The heart of it all.
to be part of these trials.
Right.
So as our sources emphasize, it's really a human endeavor at its core.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
This drive to understand diseases, to, ease suffering,
Mm-hmm.
and to ultimately improve people's lives.
Absolutely. It's a shared goal that unites so many people across borders and disciplines.
It is, but it's also a goal that has to navigate
Oh, yeah.
what often feels like a very intricate
Definitely.
and often fragmented global landscape.
Yeah, it's a bit of a puzzle, isn't it?
It is. It's like a puzzle with a lot of pieces that don't always fit together neatly.
Exactly. And I think a good place to start unraveling that puzzle
Okay.
is to look at the regulatory side of things.
Okay. Regulation.
Because let's face it, every country wants to make sure that any new medicine being tested within its borders
Right.
is safe and effective for its citizens.
Right. That makes sense.
So naturally, each country has its own set of rules and regulations and procedures.
And so how do researchers even begin to untangle that whole web of regulations?
Well, it's tricky, but that's where the concept of harmonization comes in.
Okay, harmonization.
So while each nation has its own regulatory authority, like the FDA here in the US or the European Medicines Agency in Europe,
Right.
there's also this recognition that we need some level of global consistency
Okay.
to streamline the process of drug development.
That makes sense.
So that's where organizations like the International Council for Harmonization, or ICH, come into play.
Yeah, ICH.
Yeah, they work to establish international guidelines for various aspects of drug development.
Okay, so give me an example. Like, what kind of guidelines are we talking about?
Well, everything from how clinical trials are designed and conducted
Mm-hmm.
to how the data is collected, analyzed, and reported.
So it's almost like they're trying to create this internationally agreed upon set of best practices.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's about establishing a common language and framework.
Mm-hmm.
So researchers in different countries can work more efficiently together.
Okay, so the ICH is creating this sort of overarching framework,
Yeah.
but I'm guessing it's not as simple as just following the ICH guidelines and you're good to go worldwide.
You're right. It's not quite that simple.
Okay.
Because even with these international guidelines in place, Researchers still have to meticulously comply with the specific local regulations of each country where they're conducting their clinical trial.
Right, so it's like this dual regulatory landscape.
Yeah, exactly. You've got the global guidance from the ICH,
Mm-hmm.
but then you've also got the very specific requirements of each individual country.
Which could be a lot to keep track of.
It definitely can be, and it often adds significant time and cost to the whole drug development process.
Because I imagine you're basically going through a whole new approval process
You got it.
in every single country.
Pretty much. And that can sometimes add years to the timeline for bringing a new medicine to market.
Wow, so it's not just about the science.
No, it's a delicate dance between science and regulation.
It is. It's this balancing act between wanting to make sure that these drugs are safe and effective in every population,
Right.
but also trying to get them to the people who need them
Yeah, it's a complex challenge.
as quickly as possible.
Absolutely.
It is. All right, so you've jumped through all the regulatory hoops.
Right.
You've got your approvals. You're ready to go. But then you actually have to run a multinational trial,
Right.
which just the logistics of that
Oh, yeah.
blow my mind a little bit.
It's a massive undertaking coordinating research sites across different time zones,
That's true.
different languages, different cultures.
Where do you even begin to organize something that big?
Well, you need a really, really good plan.
Okay.
And impeccable communication is absolutely paramount.
Right, because you've got research teams all over the world.
Exactly. Each one operating on a different schedule and potentially speaking different languages.
So how do you make sure everybody is on the same page?
It's a combination of things. You need clear protocols,
Okay.
regular meetings, video conferencing,
Right.
and often a dedicated team whose sole job is to manage the logistics of the trial.
Like a global project management team.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you have the practical challenges
Oh, yeah.
of shipping things internationally.
Right, like the actual drugs.
Yes, the investigational drugs themselves and biological samples,
Hmm.
like blood or tissue samples.
So it's not just like sending a package through the mail.
Not even close. You need a detailed documentation. To comply with all the import and export regulations,
Right.
you have to ensure proper labeling and identification at every single site.
So no mix-ups.
Exactly. And you need to think about temperature control.
Oh, right. Because some of those drugs can be pretty sensitive.
Absolutely. Some drugs have to be kept at very specific temperatures
Yeah.
throughout the entire journey, or they degrade.
So you can't just toss a vial of some experimental medicine in a box
You can.
and hope for the best.
And hope it makes it halfway across the world intact.
Exactly. You need specialized packaging
Right.
and shipping procedures
Yeah.
to maintain the integrity of those drugs.
It's a whole science in itself.
And one of the sources even mentions
Mm-hmm.
that just the storage of the drug ingredients needs to be carefully considered too.
Oh, absolutely. You have to think about environmental factors like temperature,
Right.
humidity, light exposure.
To make sure those ingredients stay stable.
Yeah, all of that can affect the quality and efficacy of the final drug product.
Right. So it's like this chain of custody
Exactly.
that has to be maintained at every step of the way.
From the moment the ingredients are manufactured
Yeah.
to the moment the drug is administered to a patient in the trial.
And speaking of manufacturing,
Yeah,
what about the actual production of the drugs that are being used in these trials?
that's another huge piece of the puzzle.
Because now you're potentially talking about multiple manufacturing locations.
Often in different countries
Well,
with
yeah.
different standards.
And so how do you ensure that the quality of the drug is consistent?
Well, that's where good manufacturing practices, or GMPs, become absolutely critical.
Okay. GMPs.
GMPs are essentially a set of guidelines that ensure drugs are consistently produced and controlled according to very strict quality standards.
So it's kind of like a global quality control standard for pharmaceuticals.
Exactly. And these standards cover everything from the facilities themselves to the equipment, the personnel, the processes.
So it's not just about making sure the drug is made correctly.
No, it's about ensuring that every step of the manufacturing process
Right.
is controlled and documented.
So there's no room for error.
Ideally, no room for error because you want to minimize any risk
Mm-hmm.
that could compromise the safety and efficacy of the final product.
Right. Which is even more important when you're talking about a drug that's being tested in a clinical trial.
Absolutely, because you're dealing with human lives.
Exactly. And so far, we've talked about regulations, we've talked about logistics, we've talked about manufacturing,
Right.
but then there's this whole other layer,
Oh, yes.
which is the human element.
The most important element.
I think so. The cultural and ethical considerations
Mhm.
of conducting trials in different parts of the world.
And that's a conversation we definitely need to have.
It is, because it's one thing to follow the regulations,
Mm-hmm.
But it's another thing entirely to actually work with people.
Especially when those people come from diverse cultural backgrounds.
Right. And so how do you ensure that you're conducting these trials ethically?
Well, first and foremost, ethical conduct has to be the foundation of
Oh.
all clinical research.
Absolutely.
And this becomes even more critical
Okay.
when you're working across different cultures with different values and beliefs.
Because what might be considered ethical in one culture
Right.
might not be in another.
Exactly. So researchers have to be extremely sensitive to these differences.
And so how do they navigate that?
Well, in each country where a trial is being conducted,
Mm-hmm.
you have to get approval from a local ethics committee or institutional review board,
Sometimes called an IRB.
right, an IRB, and these local bodies,
Mm-hmm.
they're responsible for making sure that the trial is ethically sound and culturally appropriate.
So it's not just a rubber stamp.
Not at all. They carefully review the trial protocol,
Okay.
the informed consent
Right.
documents,
Right.
and they consider the potential risks and benefits to the participants.
And I imagine one of the biggest challenges in global trials
Mm-hmm.
is obtaining truly informed consent.
Absolutely, because you have to make sure that the participants really understand what they're signing up for.
Right. And that they're not being coerced or pressured in any way.
Exactly. And this becomes even more complicated
Yeah.
when you're dealing with different languages and different cultural norms around medical decision-making.
Right, because in some cultures, for example,
Mm-hmm.
the decision to participate in a medical trial might involve the entire family.
Right. It's not just an individual decision.
And so researchers have to be aware of and respect those cultural dynamics.
Absolutely. They have to be very careful to ensure that consent is truly voluntary and informed.
And then on top of all of that,
Mm-hmm.
there's this really critical aspect
Yes.
of global trials that I think we need to discuss,
Let's do it.
which is the importance of diversity.
Diversity in clinical trials.
Yes, both in terms of including different populations
Mm-hmm.
and really understanding the role of genetic diversity in how drugs work.
It's incredibly important.
Why is that so vital?
Well, because people are different. We have different genetic makeups, different lifestyles, different environments.
And all of that can affect how our bodies respond to medication.
Exactly. And historically, clinical trials have often been criticized for not being representative of the real world.
Okay. How so?
Well, they've often overrepresented certain groups.
Okay.
Like white men, for example,
Mhm.
and underrepresented other groups.
That's women and people of color.
Exactly. And that's a problem because it means that we might not be getting a complete picture
Right.
of how a drug will work in different populations.
So if you only test a drug in a very narrow slice of the population,
Mm-hmm.
you might miss some really important safety issues
Absolutely.
or differences in how effective the drug is.
And that's why there's this increasing focus now on including more diverse populations in clinical trials.
So tell me more about that. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it means actively recruiting participants from different ethnic groups, different age groups, different genders, different socioeconomic backgrounds.
So you're trying to get a much broader representation of humanity.
Exactly, because the goal is to ensure that the medicines we develop
Mm-hmm.
are safe and effective for everyone who needs them.
And this also brings up the issue of genetic diversity.
Right, because genetic variations can have a huge impact on how our bodies process drugs.
So can you break that down for me a little bit?
Sure. So our genes influence everything from how our bodies metabolize drugs
Mm-hmm.
to how those drugs interact with their targets in the body.
And so a drug that might work really well in one person
Right.
might not work as well or could even be harmful in someone else.
Exactly. And that's why understanding genetic diversity is so crucial for developing safe and effective medications.
And the source material mentions something called enrichment strategies.
Oh, yes. Enrichment strategies are becoming increasingly common in clinical trials.
So what are those?
So enrichment strategies involve selecting participants based on specific characteristics, like certain genetic markers or the presence of a particular disease subtype.
And why do they do that?
Well, the idea is to increase the likelihood of seeing a drug effect
Okay.
by focusing on the patients who are most likely to benefit from the treatment.
So it's kind of like narrowing the focus of the trial.
Exactly. And it can be very useful for proving that a drug works and for understanding its mechanism of action.
But are there any downsides to this approach?
Well, one potential downside is that it can limit the generalizability of the findings.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
So if you only test a drug in a very specific subset of patients,
Right.
it's harder to know for sure how it will work in the broader population.
Right, because the people in the trial might not be representative of everyone.
Exactly. And that's why regulatory agencies often require something called post-market surveillance.
After a drug has been approved.
Exactly. So even after a drug is on the market, they continue to collect data to see how it's working in the real world.
In a more diverse group of people.
Exactly. And this helps to identify any potential safety issues or differences in efficacy that might not have shown up in the original trials.
So it's kind of like an ongoing safety check.
Exactly. It's an important part of ensuring that new medicines are both safe and effective.
For everyone who needs them.
Precisely. And, one of the things that I found really fascinating in the source material was the discussion of how technology and artificial intelligence are playing an increasingly important role in global clinical trials.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about that.
Because when you're dealing with such massive amounts of data coming in from all over the world, technology is essential for managing all of that information.
So what kind of technology are we talking about here?
Well, things like electronic data capture systems, which allow researchers to collect and store data electronically instead of using paper forms.
Right, which would be a nightmare.
A total nightmare. And then you have cloud-based platforms that enable real-time communication and collaboration among research teams.
So no matter where they are in the world.
Exactly. They can all access the same data and communicate with each other easily.
And these platforms can also help with things like language translation.
Absolutely, which is crucial for global trials where people might be speaking different languages.
And then on top of that, you have artificial intelligence, or AI.
Which is being used to analyze this vast amount of data and identify patterns.
So it's like AI is helping us to see things
Exactly.
that we might not be able to see with the naked eye.
It can help us to identify potential safety signals to predict which patients are most likely to respond to a treatment.
So it's kind of like AI is helping us to personalize medicine.
Yeah, in a way, it's allowing us to tailor treatments to individual patients based on their unique characteristics.
Which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is. It's really revolutionizing the way we develop and deliver healthcare.
And one of the things that I found really fascinating in the source material was this idea that even seemingly small details in the drug development process can have huge ripple effects down the line.
Oh, absolutely.
Like they gave this example of how the material of a reactor in a manufacturing plant actually ended up affecting the purity of a drug.
It's amazing how something so seemingly insignificant can have such a big impact.
It really underscores just how meticulous you have to be at every step of the process.
Absolutely. Precision and attention to detail are paramount.
And another thing that really struck me was the discussion of bioavailability.
Ah, yes, bioavailability. That's a crucial concept in drug development.
So for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term,
of course,
can you explain what it means?
Sure. So bioavailability essentially refers to how much of the drug that you take actually gets into your bloodstream.
Okay.
And becomes available to have an effect.
Right, because you could take a pill, but if the drug doesn't actually get absorbed into your body, it's not going to do anything.
Exactly. So bioavailability is a really important factor in determining the effectiveness of a drug.
And the source material emphasizes that when you're running global trials, you have to be really careful to use standardized procedures.
For measuring bioavailability.
Yeah, because otherwise you're comparing apples to oranges.
Exactly. Yeah. You can't have one research site using one method and another site using a different method.
And then trying to combine that data.
It just won't be reliable.
So standardization is key.
Absolutely. It's essential for ensuring that the data you're collecting from different sites is actually comparable.
And another challenge that was mentioned in the source material was the issue of drug solubility and permeability.
Ah, yes. Those are two key factors that can affect how a drug is absorbed and distributed in the body.
Can you break those down for us?
Sure. So solubility refers to how well a drug dissolves in fluids, like your stomach fluids or your blood. And permeability refers to how easily the drug can pass through cell membranes to reach its target in the body.
And so how do those factors play into global clinical trials?
Well, certain drugs might have solubility or permeability issues that make it difficult to develop a formulation that's effective in all populations.
So give me an example.
Sure. So some drugs might dissolve really easily, but then they have trouble getting absorbed into the bloodstream, or they might be absorbed well, but then they get broken down too quickly by the liver.
So they're not active long enough.
Exactly. And these kinds of challenges can be even more pronounced in global trials where you're dealing with different diets, different genetics, different environmental factors.
Right. So something that works well in one population might not work as well in another.
And that's why drug formulation is such an important part of the drug development process.
And it's not just about getting the drug into a pill or a capsule.
No, it's about creating a formulation that will deliver the drug to the right place in the body, at the right concentration, and for the right amount of time.
It's like this delicate balancing act.
It is, and it requires a deep understanding of both the drug itself and the human body.
And, as we've been talking about all these complexities, I can't help but think about the sheer amount of data that must be generated
it's astronomical
from all these global trials.
Yeah, we're talking about mountains of data.
And how do you even begin to make sense of all that information?
Well, that's where technology comes in again. We talked about data management systems and cloud-based platforms. But there are also sophisticated data analysis tools that can help researchers to sift through all that data and extract meaningful insights.
So it's not just about collecting the data.
No, it's about making sense of it.
And turning it into knowledge.
Exactly. And this is where things like biostatistics and bioinformatics come in. These are specialized fields that use statistical and computational methods to analyze biological data.
So it's like you need a whole team of experts.
Yeah, you do.
Just to handle the data.
From statisticians to computer scientists to data visualization experts.
Right, because you need to be able to see the patterns in the data.
Yeah, you need to be able to tell the story of the data.
And I imagine that this is another area where AI is starting to play a role.
Oh, absolutely. AI is being used to automate some of the data analysis tasks and to identify patterns that humans might miss.
So it's like AI is augmenting the capabilities of the human researchers.
Exactly. It's helping us to analyze data more efficiently and accurately.
And to make better decisions about drug development.
Precisely. It's a really exciting time to be working in this field.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the complexities of global clinical trials, what are some of the key takeaways that you think our listeners should really walk away with?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that global drug development is a truly collaborative effort.
Yeah, we talked about that at the beginning.
It requires the expertise of scientists, clinicians, regulators, ethicists, statisticians.
And patients.
And, of course, the patients themselves.
It really is a global endeavor.
It is. And another key takeaway is that it's incredibly complex.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground today.
There are so many factors to consider.
From the science, to the regulations, to the logistics.
To the culture.
And those seemingly small details.
Right.
That can make all the difference.
Like the material of that reactor.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the specific method for measuring bioavailability.
It's all connected.
It is. And I think another important takeaway is that this complexity is the reason why drug development takes so long and why it's so expensive.
It's not just about discovering a new molecule in the lab.
No, it's about making sure that that molecule is safe and effective for all the different people who might need it.
And that takes time and resources.
Absolutely, but it's an investment worth making.
Because ultimately, it's about improving human health.
Exactly. It's about finding new treatments for diseases that cause suffering.
And extending human life.
And improving the quality of that life.
And for me, the biggest light bulb moment was really understanding the importance of diversity.
In clinical trials.
Yes, both in terms of the participants themselves and in terms of the researchers.
Right, because different perspectives lead to better science.
Exactly, and I think that's a perfect note to end on.
I agree.
So here's a final thought for you to consider.
Okay.
As the world becomes increasingly interconnected, how can we make global clinical trials even more efficient and collaborative while still upholding the highest ethical standards and ensuring that the benefits of these new treatments reach all populations equitably?
It's a big question.
It's a question that researchers and policymakers are grappling with right now.
And it's a question that we'll continue to explore
on future deep dives.
I look forward to it.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep learning.